The explosion of HMS Hood was not just the destruction of a warship, it was the shattering of British pride. The morning after the disaster, the news echoed across Britain like a funeral bell. Newspapers carried headlines screaming, "Hood lost nearly all hands." For millions, it was unthinkable. The invincible had fallen. The Royal Navy, the symbol of Britain's power and endurance, had been humiliated by a single German battleship. But grief quickly hardened into fury. From the Admiralty in London came a message that would define the next chapter of the war at sea. Sink the Bismarck, at all costs. The command was absolute. Every available warship in the Atlantic was redirected toward one single mission: hunt down the Bismarck. The Royal Navy deployed a massive armada: aircraft carriers like Ark Royal and Victorious, battleships King George V and Rodney, cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk, and dozens of destroyers. The North Atlantic, vast, gray, and unforgiving, became a battlefield of vengeance. Far out on the ocean, Bismarck sailed on. Her hull bore scars from the battle. One of Prince of Wales, shells had punctured a fuel tank, leaving an oily trail across the sea. Inside the ship, engineers worked furiously, pumping fuel and sealing leaks. But Captain Ernst Lindemann knew the situation was growing desperate. "We must reach France," he said grimly to his officers. "The British will not stop until we are destroyed." Admiral Gunther Lütjens, the commander of the operation, stood on the bridge, silent and composed. He knew that the Bismarck, for all her power, was now a hunted beast. His goal was to reach the safety of occupied France, where German air cover could protect them. But the Royal Navy was closing in. On May 25th, as Bismarck slipped through fog and storms, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park intercepted German radio messages. Using their decrypting systems, they began piecing together the ship's position. The Admiralty plotted the coordinates. The chase was on. Across the Atlantic, aircraft carriers launched reconnaissance planes. Pilots scanned endless gray waves for any sign of the steel giant. The crew of the Bismarck, meanwhile, were exhausted but disciplined. The smell of oil and cordite filled the air below deck. Some sailors whispered about the destruction of Hood. Proud but uneasy, they knew the British would not forgive. And above all, there was an eerie silence. No radio, no news, no certainty. Only the sound of waves crashing against the hull. On the evening of May 26th, a stroke of luck changed everything. A Catalina flying boat from the Royal Air Force spotted an oil slick on the ocean's surface, a telltale sign of a damaged warship. Moments later, the crew sighted Bismarck herself, slicing through the gray sea toward France. The message went out immediately: Bismarck sighted. The coordinates flashed through every ship in the British fleet. Within hours, dozens of warships altered their course. Ark Royal launched a squadron of Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers, fragile, slow biplanes made of canvas and metal, relics of an earlier age. But they were about to make history. As darkness fell, the Swordfish dived through rain and wind toward their target. Anti-aircraft guns erupted from Bismarck's decks, spraying the sky with tracer fire. The bombers dodged and twisted through walls of flak. Then, one by one, they dropped their torpedoes. The sea exploded with geysers of water. Most missed, but one struck true. The torpedo hit Bismarck's stern, jamming her rudders. The great battleship began to turn helplessly in circles. The crew struggled desperately to regain control, but it was too late. The ship that had destroyed HMS Hood was now crippled, trapped in the middle of the Atlantic. Aboard Bismarck, panic turned to grim realization. Lindemann ordered his engineers to try and repair the steering gear, but the damage was beyond their reach. The once proud battleship could now only move slowly, and in the wrong direction. The hunters were closing in. Throughout the night, British destroyers shadowed her, darting in and out of the darkness, launching torpedoes and lighting the sea with star shells. Bismarck's massive guns roared back, scattering the destroyers but unable to shake them off. The Royal Navy smelled blood. On the morning of May 27, 1941, the horizon glowed red. Two British battleships, King George V and Rodney, loomed out of the mist. The trap was complete. Bismarck, unable to steer, faced them head-on. Her crew braced for the inevitable. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and cornered, but they would not surrender. In the next section, the world would witness one of the most ferocious final stands in naval history. a duel between the hunter and the hunted, between pride and doom. The morning of May 27, 1941, dawned cold and merciless over the North Atlantic. The sea was restless, heavy gray clouds cloaked the horizon, and the wind howled across the waves like a warning. On the crippled German battleship Bismarck, the crew prepared for what they all knew would be their last battle. Inside the steel fortress, men moved with grim determination. Their uniforms were soaked, their faces drawn from exhaustion, but their resolve was unbroken. Captain Ernst Lindemann stood on the bridge, his jaw tight, his voice calm. "We will fight until the last shell is fired," he said. Around him, the officers nodded. They knew there would be no rescue, no escape, only glory or oblivion. At 8:45 a.m., the British fleet appeared like specters through the mist. The massive HMS Rodney and King George V closed in from the northwest, their guns already turning toward the wounded giant. The British sailors, many of whom had lost friends on the Hood, were eager for retribution. This was not just a mission, it was vengeance. Aboard Rodney, Captain Frederick Dalrymple Hamilton gave a single command that would echo across the sea. "Open fire." The first salvo roared through the Atlantic air. Giant shells screamed toward the German ship, smashing into the water in towering plumes. Seconds later, Bismarck returned fire. Her main turrets thundered, shaking the very ocean, sending 15-inch shells hurtling toward the British line. But Bismarck's fate was sealed from the beginning. Her damaged rudders meant she could not maneuver. She was a sitting target. The British ships circled her like wolves around a wounded bear, firing relentlessly. Within minutes, the air filled with the deafening rhythm of naval warfare. The flash of explosions, the whistle of shells, the tearing of steel. The once proud battleship that had sunk the Hood was now being torn apart, piece by piece. A shell from Rodney struck Bismarck's forward gun turret, blasting it open in a fireball. Another hit the bridge, killing many of the officers. Below deck, fires spread rapidly through the compartments. But still, the Germans fought on. Gunners, their faces blackened with soot, reloaded what few shells they had left. Medics dragged the wounded through smoke-filled corridors. The engine room crews kept the ship's heart beating as long as they could. Captain Lindemann refused to abandon his post. Standing on the tilting bridge, he shouted over the chaos, "Don't let her fall silent, keep firing!" His voice carried the pride of the Kriegsmarine, the last echo of Germany's naval ambition. For nearly 2 hours, the Bismarck endured the unendurable. More than 2,800 shells were fired at her, each one a blow to her armor, her pride, her legend. The British gunners watched in disbelief as she refused to sink. But eventually, the firepower overwhelmed her. Her turrets were silent now, her decks blazing. Smoke poured from the wounds in her hull. Still, she floated, defiant. At 10:20 a.m., with her weapons destroyed and her decks littered with the dead, the German sailors began scuttling the ship. They opened valves, detonated charges, determined that the British would not claim her as a prize. In the control room, Chief Engineer Gerhard Unack turned the valves with trembling hands, his face illuminated by the glow of fire. "She must go down," he whispered. "No enemy will take her." Minutes later, explosions rippled through her lower decks. Seawater surged in, swallowing the ship from within. Men scrambled for life rafts, but the waves were merciless. From the distance, the British sailors stood in awe. They watched the ship that had terrorized the Atlantic for weeks slowly tip to one side. Her bow rose, her stern sank, and for a brief moment Bismarck stood upright, proud and silent against the storm. Then she was gone. At 10:39 a.m., the great battleship slipped beneath the waves, disappearing into the cold depths of the Atlantic. The sea closed over her like a curtain, leaving only oil, debris, and the cries of a few survivors. Out of her crew of more than 2,200 men, only 115 survived. The Royal Navy ceased fire. Silence fell over the sea. The revenge for HMS Hood had been exacted, but it did not feel like triumph, only a somber reminder of the cost of war. As King George V turned away, Admiral Tovey wrote in his report, "The Bismarck fought to the end, and her people went down with her. She was a magnificent ship." Beneath the ocean, the wreck of Bismarck would remain untouched for decades, a steel tomb lying 3 miles below the surface, a ghost from a war that consumed millions. Yet her story, of pride, power, vengeance, and tragedy, would live on as one of the most haunting legends of naval warfare. The sea was calm again, eerily so. Where just hours earlier the sky had roared with fire and thunder, now there was only silence, the sound of wind brushing over the waves and the faint cries of the few who had survived. The Bismarck, pride of Nazi Germany, was gone. The Royal Navy ships circled the debris-strewn waters cautiously. Oil slicks stretched across the Atlantic, glinting under the gray morning light. Pieces of twisted metal floated beside lifeless bodies, a grim reminder that this battle had not been won easily. The order came down from the bridge of HMS Dorsetshire. Begin rescue operations. British sailors lowered boats, pulling exhausted German survivors from the freezing water. Many were barely conscious, their faces pale, their lips blue. Among them were sailors, gunners, engineers, men who had spent the last 48 hours fighting for their lives in a burning ship. Some wept silently, others stared blankly at the waves, haunted by the vision of their comrades sinking beneath the sea. One survivor, Otto Maus, later described the moment. When the Bismarck went down, it was as if the sea swallowed not just the ship, but our souls with it. The noise, the fire, the screams. And then nothing. Just silence. Of Bismarck's over 2,200 crew, only 115 survived. When the rescue was interrupted by the sudden appearance of a German U-boat on sonar, the British were forced to leave. Hundreds still floated alive in the water, calling out, clinging to wreckage. But the Royal Navy could not risk losing more men. The order was given to withdraw. The sea claimed the rest. By afternoon, the Atlantic was empty again. The greatest battleship Germany had ever built now rested at the bottom of the ocean, along with the hopes of the Kriegsmarine. Back in Berlin, the news of Bismarck's loss was a national shock. Just days earlier, Nazi propaganda had celebrated her as an invincible symbol of German might. Now that pride turned into disbelief and sorrow. Families of sailors waited for word that never came. Radio announcements called it a heroic last stand, but inside Germany, the message was clear. Even the strongest could fall. Hitler himself was said to be furious. He had believed the Bismarck untouchable. After hearing the details of her destruction, he reportedly remarked bitterly, "I no longer wish to risk our ships. The Navy is finished." From that point forward, Germany's surface fleet rarely ventured far from port again. The Bismarck's death marked not just the end of a ship, but the death of Nazi Germany's naval ambitions. In London, however, the news was met with a mixture of triumph and grief. For the sailors of the Royal Navy, this was justice for the HMS Hood, but the victory felt hollow. Over 1,400 British sailors had perished with the Hood, and now more than 2,000 Germans had joined them in watery graves. Winston Churchill addressed Parliament, his words solemn yet resolute. The destruction of the Bismarck was the end of a monster, but it was also the end of an era of battleships. The sea is still cruel, and it takes its toll on all who challenge it. For decades, the exact location of the Bismarck remained a mystery. Only in 1989, almost 50 years later, did oceanographer Dr. Robert Ballard, the same man who discovered the Titanic, find the wreck. 3 miles beneath the surface, lying upright on the seabed, the Bismarck was astonishingly intact. Her hull still bore the scars of battle, shell holes, twisted turrets, and torn armor plates. The forward guns were pointed upward, as if still defying the heavens. Ballard described the scene with awe. She rests like a sleeping giant, silent, proud, and untouched. Even in death, the Bismarck commands respect. Explorers who visited the wreck later reported something haunting. The ship looked less like a ruin and more like a tomb. Inside were the remains of hundreds of sailors, preserved by the cold darkness of the deep. Out of respect, no attempt was made to salvage or disturb her. The site was officially declared a war grave. But beyond the wreck itself, the Bismarck's legacy lived on in history, literature, and song. The story of her rise and fall became one of the most studied naval tales of the 20th century, a story of technological brilliance and human tragedy. Her construction represented the peak of naval engineering. She was fast, heavily armed, and nearly invulnerable. Yet her story also revealed the limits of power. One small flaw, a damaged rudder, sealed her fate. The lesson was stark. Even the mightiest machine is vulnerable to nature, chance, and persistence. For the survivors, life after the war was a quiet burden. Many rarely spoke of that day. Some lived with survivors' guilt, others with pride. In post-war interviews, former crew members described the Bismarck not as a weapon of war, but as a home. One that took their friends, their youth, and their peace. One survivor, Heinrich Kunt, reflected decades later. "We were young and we believed in duty. But when I close my eyes, I still hear the explosions, still feel the deck trembling under my feet. The sea never forgets." Today, the Bismarck remains a symbol, not of Nazi power, but of the human cost of war and the fragility of pride. Every rivet in her hull tells a story of ambition, courage, and loss. The battle to sink her was one of the most dramatic naval chases in history, but it also stands as a warning that in war, even victory tastes of salt and sorrow. Above the place where she sleeps, the waves roll endlessly on, indifferent, eternal. The Atlantic has reclaimed its secret, and the echoes of guns have long faded. But deep below, in the cold silence, the Bismarck still stands, a monument to the men who sailed her and to the tragic futility of war. When the Bismarck sank beneath the waves of the North Atlantic on May 27, 1941, the shock waves of her destruction traveled far beyond the battlefield. This was not merely the loss of a warship. It was the fall of a symbol, the crumbling of an illusion of invincibility. For both sides, German and British alike, the Bismarck's end carried psychological, emotional, and cultural consequences that would echo for generations. The German psyche, from pride to despair. Before her maiden voyage, the Bismarck had been the embodiment of Nazi Germany's power and pride. Newspapers called her unsinkbar, unsinkable. Posters depicted her slicing through the waves like a god of steel. She represented the modern strength of a nation determined to dominate the seas once again after the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. But after just one mission, she was gone. The German people, who had cheered her launch, now listened in disbelief to the radio broadcasts confirming her loss. The propaganda machine of Joseph Goebbels tried desperately to frame the event as a heroic last stand, calling the crew martyrs of the sea. Yet behind closed doors, even the most loyal officers knew that something had changed. Hitler's trust in his navy was shattered. "If the best ship of the Reich can be destroyed in a few days," he reportedly said, "then the navy has no future." His attention shifted completely to the Army and Air Force. From that day on, large-scale German naval operations virtually ceased. The Kriegsmarine lost its confidence, its prestige, and its commander's faith, all in one battle. For the sailors who survived, the loss was deeply personal. Many carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. They had watched their comrades drown, had seen the pride of their nation vanish beneath the waves. In the years after the war, they struggled to reconcile loyalty with trauma. "We thought we were invincible," said survivor Otto Maus. "When the ship went down, part of us went with her." The British perspective, triumph and tragedy. Across the Channel, in Britain, the mood was more complex. The sinking of the Bismarck was hailed as one of the Royal Navy's greatest victories, revenge for the HMS Hood, whose destruction had stunned the Empire only days before. Newspapers carried bold headlines. "Bismarck destroyed!" Bells rang across the nation. For a moment, the weary British people suffering through the Blitz felt hope again. Yet beneath the celebration lay sorrow. Over 2,000 men had died in the freezing waters of the Atlantic, and most were enemies who had fought with courage. British sailors who participated in the battle later admitted to feeling a strange mix of triumph and guilt. "We sank her," said one gunner aboard HMS King George V. "But when I saw the wreckage and the oil, I felt no joy, only silence." Churchill, too, understood the bittersweet nature of the victory. He praised the Navy's determination, but in his memoirs he wrote, "The Bismarck was a magnificent ship. Her destruction was necessary, but not something to rejoice over." It was the end of one chapter of war, a chapter written in steel and blood. The global symbolism of the Bismarck. The story of the Bismarck transcended borders. To the world, she became more than a warship. She became a symbol of the struggle between power and fate. Her short but dramatic life, from the glory of her launch to the relentless pursuit that ended her, turned into a legend of the sea. Authors, historians, and journalists turned her story into a cautionary tale about hubris. The idea that something so massive, so advanced, could fall so quickly resonated deeply in the modern age. She was compared to the Titanic, another vessel declared unsinkable. Both met their doom on the same ocean, both victims of human overconfidence. In post-war Germany, the Bismarck's image evolved. She was no longer seen as a Nazi war machine, but as a tragic masterpiece, a symbol of wasted brilliance and lost lives. Naval historians called her a monument to German engineering and human folly alike. In literature and popular culture, the Bismarck story found its way into countless books, documentaries, and songs. In 1959, British author C.S. Forester published The Last 9 Days of the Bismarck, a gripping account that humanized both the British and German crews. The book inspired the 1960 film Sink the Bismarck, which dramatized the naval chase that captured the world's imagination. The film became a classic, remembered not only for its thrilling battle scenes, but for its portrayal of the men behind the machines, the fear, the pride, and the duty that drove them. For many, it was the first time they truly understood the psychological toll of the pursuit. Then came the famous 1960 song by Johnny Horton, Sink the Bismarck, which turned the battle into a piece of popular history. Its catchy rhythm and patriotic lyrics immortalized the chase in public memory. "We gotta sink the Bismarck because the world depends on us." Through media, the Bismarck's legacy extended far beyond the war. She became a cultural icon, not of Nazi power, but of human resilience, determination, and tragedy. Naval doctrine and strategic lessons beyond popular culture, the Bismarck changed how navies thought about warfare. Her sinking exposed critical flaws in battleship design and strategy. Despite her immense firepower and armor, she was ultimately undone by air power. A single torpedo from a slow-moving biplane crippled her rudder, sealing her fate. Naval tacticians across the world took notice. The age of the battleship was ending. The aircraft carrier had proven itself the new master of the seas. After 1941, no major navy ever built another ship like the Bismarck. For the British, the victory reinforced the importance of intelligence and coordination, radar, reconnaissance, and airstrikes working together. For the Germans, it was a harsh reminder that isolation in war is fatal. The Bismarck's final voyage became a textbook example of what happens when technology and arrogance outrun strategy and logistics. A ghost beneath the waves. Decades later, when Robert Ballard discovered the Bismarck's resting place in 1989, the world was reminded once again of her story. Photographs of the wreck showed a vessel eerily preserved, her guns still pointing skyward, her hull still bearing the proud eagle emblem. For many, seeing her again after so long brought a sense of closure. Memorials were held in both Britain and Germany, honoring not just the sailors who fought, but the shared humanity of those who perished. "We were enemies then," said a British veteran at one ceremony, "but we were all men of the sea." Enduring lessons. The Bismarck's story endures because it speaks to something deeper than war, the eternal tension between human ambition and the unforgiving power of nature. She was built to dominate, yet the sea, as always, had the final word. Her destruction marked the twilight of an era. No longer would nations build floating fortresses of steel. The future of warfare would belong to the skies and to speed, not armor. But for all its lessons, the Bismarck's tale remains at its heart a human story of courage, pride, loss, and the unbreakable spirit of those who sail into the unknown. Today, her name still stirs emotion. Some see her as a warning, others as a monument. But all agree on one thing. The Bismarck will never be forgotten. Beneath 3 miles of cold Atlantic darkness, she still lies silently, not as a weapon of war, but as a ghost of history. A reminder that even the mightiest must one day face the deep. Nearly half a century after the Bismarck sank beneath the stormy Atlantic waves, the world still whispered her name with a mixture of awe and sorrow. Her story had become the stuff of naval legend, a saga of power, pride, and downfall. Yet one question remained unanswered. Where exactly did the Bismarck rest? For decades, her final resting place was a mystery buried beneath 3 miles of ocean darkness. Survivors could only recall the chaos of that final morning, explosions, flames, and the roar of collapsing steel. Historians estimated her coordinates, but the Atlantic was vast and merciless. The sea guards its secrets well. The quest begins. It wasn't until the 1980s that technology finally caught up with human curiosity. The man who would find her was Dr. Robert Ballard, the same oceanographer who had discovered the Titanic just a few years earlier. For Ballard, the Bismarck was more than a wreck. It was a puzzle left unsolved, a symbol of wartime tragedy that demanded closure. In 1989, aboard the research vessel Knorr, Ballard's team set sail on a mission codenamed Project Deep Search. The area they intended to scan was enormous, nearly 400 square miles of seafloor. Using robotic submersibles equipped with sonar and cameras, they combed the depths inch by inch. For days, there was nothing but silence. The Atlantic, indifferent as ever, offered no clues. The crew grew weary. But on June 8, 1989, their sonar picked up an unusual shape, a shadow on the seafloor, almost 16,000 feet below the surface. As the cameras descended into the abyss, a haunting sight emerged from the gloom. A massive steel hull, upright, majestic even in death. The unmistakable bow of the Bismarck slowly materialized, her swastika still faintly visible beneath decades of sediment. After 48 years, she had been found. The first look, beneath the waves. The images that came back were breathtaking. Unlike the Titanic, which had broken into pieces, the Bismarck lay largely intact. Her hull bore the scars of fierce battle, gaping holes from British shells, twisted metal where fire had ravaged her decks, but her structure still commanded respect. Ballard and his team observed that much of the ship seemed eerily preserved. The massive guns of her main turrets were still aimed toward the sky, as if locked in eternal defiance. Her bridge was collapsed, her superstructure torn apart, yet her shape was unmistakably proud. Perhaps most haunting was the realization that over 2,000 men still rested inside. The wreck was a war grave, a silent tomb for the sailors who had gone down with their ship. Ballard, moved by what he saw, made a solemn promise. The Bismarck would not be disturbed. No treasure hunts, no recoveries, only remembrance. The debate. Who sank the Bismarck? The rediscovery reignited one of history's most controversial naval debates. Who actually sank the Bismarck? British accounts had long claimed that their relentless bombardment destroyed the ship, but Ballard's examination suggested a more complex truth. The hull was riddled with shell holes, yes, but not enough to explain total destruction. The structural integrity of the ship implied that she had not been blown apart from outside. Rather, she had sunk in a controlled descent. This led many historians to revisit the German survivors' testimonies. They had insisted that the Bismarck's crew had scuttled the ship, detonating internal charges to prevent her from falling into enemy hands. Ballard's evidence seemed to support that theory. In other words, the Bismarck was not destroyed by the British alone. She was finished by her own crew, a final act of defiance. Even in defeat, the Bismarck had chosen her fate. The Bismarck as a war grave. In the wake of Ballard's discovery, both Britain and Germany issued official statements recognizing the Bismarck as a war grave. No nation would claim ownership. No expedition would disturb her. Memorial plaques were later placed at sea above the wreck's coordinates reading, "To the memory of the brave men who gave their lives aboard the battleship Bismarck. May they rest in peace beneath the waves." And, for many families, this offered long-awaited closure. Sons who had never met their fathers, widows who had never seen their husbands again, finally had a place to mourn. Some even traveled to the North Atlantic, scattering flowers on the water above where the ship lay. Echoes of Steel, the legacy of the Bismarck. The rediscovery of the Bismarck reignited global fascination with naval history. Documentaries aired across the world, blending haunting underwater footage with survivor testimonies. Books and films retold the story with new emotion and insight. What struck audiences most was not just the technology of the ship, but the humanity behind it. The letters of the sailors, many written the night before the final battle, revealed young men full of hope, loyalty, and fear. One letter, found decades later, read, "If we do not return, know that I fought for honor, not for hate." These words transformed the Bismarck's story from a tale of war to one of shared humanity. It reminded viewers that beneath the flags and emblems, every sailor, British or German, had been a son, a brother, a friend. Modern reflections. Today, the Bismarck stands as both a technological marvel and a moral monument. She represents the limits of human ambition, the point where pride collides with consequence. In naval academies, her final voyage is still studied as a lesson in tactical decision-making and vulnerability. Engineers marvel at her construction. Historians reflect on the arrogance that built her. Politicians and philosophers alike see in her story a warning about unchecked power, how even the mightiest empires can fall within days. In Germany, remembrance ceremonies for the Bismarck's crew are held quietly, with reverence rather than pride. Veterans from both sides have met to honor those lost, acknowledging that courage knows no nationality. One of the last survivors of the battle, Baron Burkhard von Müllenheim-Reschberg, once said in an interview, "We were proud of our ship, but we were prouder still of the men who stood by her to the end." History will remember them not as soldiers of tyranny, but as sailors who faced the sea with honor. The eternal silence. Beneath nearly 5,000 meters of cold, crushing darkness, the Bismarck still lies. Currents drift quietly through her corridors. Fish swim past her shattered turrets, and time continues its slow, patient erasure. Yet her presence remains defiant, a ghost of steel preserving the memory of every man who stood upon her decks. In the endless night of the Atlantic, she endures not as a weapon, but as a warning. Her story speaks of courage and loss, of the dangers of hubris, and of the tragic beauty of human ambition. For those who look upon her sonar image, that colossal shadow on the seafloor, the feeling is always the same: awe, sorrow, and respect. The Bismarck may be gone, but her echo still reverberates through history. Epilogue. In the end, the Bismarck's journey from creation to destruction to rediscovery is more than the tale of a ship. It's the story of humanity itself, of creation and destruction, of pride and humility. The sea has claimed her, as it does all things eventually, but the legend of the Bismarck remains, immortal, unbroken, and silent beneath the waves. It was a peaceful Sunday morning in Hawaii, December 7, 1941. The sun rose lazily over the Pacific, painting the calm waters of Pearl Harbor with streaks of gold and crimson. Sailors aboard the USS Arizona were just beginning their routines, some polishing brass, some writing letters home, others laughing over breakfast in the mess hall. The air was still, warm, and innocent. No one knew that within minutes, this serenity would vanish into fire and steel. At 7:55 a.m., that silence shattered. Without warning, the sound of airplane engines filled the skies. At first, a few sailors thought it was a routine U.S. Army drill. They often saw aircraft circling overhead. But as the planes drew closer, their engines screamed with fury, and the sailors noticed something strange. The planes bore rising sun insignias on their wings. Japan had come to war. The first bombs fell on the nearby airfields, followed by torpedoes slicing into the harbor's waters. Alarms blared. Sailors scrambled to battle stations, shouting in confusion and disbelief. Some ran barefoot, others still half-dressed, all caught in a storm of chaos they couldn't yet comprehend. The USS Arizona, pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, stood near the center of the harbor, a majestic battleship of nearly 600 feet, carrying over 1,500 men. She was more than a vessel. She was a floating fortress, a symbol of American power. Yet that morning, she became the focus of Japan's most devastating attack. The inferno begins. At 8:06 a.m., the Arizona's luck ran out. A formation of Japanese bombers flew directly overhead. Among them, one pilot, Lieutenant Commander Kaga, broke formation and dove toward the Arizona. He released a 1,160-pound armor-piercing bomb, modified from a naval shell. It struck near Turret 2, penetrating deep into the ship, before detonating inside her forward magazine, the storage area for hundreds of explosive shells. The result was catastrophic. A blinding flash erupted, followed by a massive explosion that ripped through the Arizona's hull. The entire forward section of the ship disintegrated in an instant. A fireball hundreds of feet high engulfed the battleship, sending debris raining across the harbor. Witnesses on nearby ships said it felt like the earth itself had cracked open. In that one terrible moment, 1,177 men, nearly the entire crew, were gone. Some were vaporized instantly. Others were trapped below deck as the ship broke apart and began to sink. The Arizona was burning from bow to stern, black smoke curling into the bright morning sky like a funeral shroud. Voices from the flames. Amid the chaos, survivors clung to life. Sailors thrown into the oil-covered water screamed for help as flames spread across the harbor's surface. A few made it to shore, their skin burned and blackened, their uniforms torn. Others tried to rescue comrades still aboard the Arizona, diving back into the inferno again and again. One survivor, Seaman First Class Don Stratton, later recalled, "I saw my ship explode beneath me. The fire was so hot it melted my skin. But the worst part wasn't the pain. It was hearing the cries from inside the ship and knowing I couldn't reach them." Another sailor, Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua, became a hero that day. Dazed but determined, he took command amid the burning wreck, directing survivors and organizing rescue efforts until he was blown overboard by a secondary explosion. For his bravery, he was later awarded the Medal of Honor. The Arizona continued to burn for 2 days, fueled by thousands of gallons of oil. Her flames could be seen for miles, her wreckage a haunting silhouette against the Hawaiian sky. A nation in shock. By the next morning, the magnitude of the attack became clear. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed, hundreds of aircraft obliterated, and over 2,400 Americans dead. But the Arizona's destruction was different. It became the symbol of the tragedy. The image of her broken hull, still burning, appeared in newspapers across the nation. For many Americans, the war had suddenly become real. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, his voice heavy with grief, addressed the nation the next day. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. And as he spoke, deep below the waters of Pearl Harbor, the USS Arizona rested silently, a grave for over 1,000 men who never left her decks. The fallen giant divers who later descended into the wreck described a scene of unimaginable destruction. The forward section had completely disintegrated, leaving twisted metal and mangled steel. Bodies lay still inside, frozen in time, untouched by the world above. The Arizona had once been the embodiment of naval strength, built in 1915, modernized in the 1930s, and celebrated as one of America's finest ships. Now she was gone, sunk in less than 9 minutes. Yet even in death, the Arizona remained a symbol of sacrifice, of courage, of the cost of freedom. Her story wasn't just about war. It was about the men who served, the lives they left behind, and the country that would rise from the ashes of that terrible day. Echoes in the water. As night fell over Pearl Harbor on December 7th, the harbor glowed faintly from burning oil slicks. The air smelled of smoke and salt and sorrow. The cries had faded, the waters had calmed, but beneath the surface, the Arizona still burned. Survivors gathered on shore, some in shock, others weeping silently. They could still see their ship, her mainmast tilted, her decks aflame. Many refused to leave, watching as the sun set behind the mountains, turning the sky blood red. They knew that their brothers, their friends, were still down there. And in their hearts, they vowed never to forget. A beginning, not an end. The attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't just the destruction of ships. It was the ignition of a global fire. The next day, America declared war on Japan, joining World War II. From the ashes of the Arizona rose a nation united in purpose, transformed by loss into determination. For those who survived, the memory of that morning would never fade. The explosion, the fire, the screams, it would echo in their dreams for decades. And for the families of the fallen, the Arizona became hallowed ground. End of Section 1. A morning that changed the world. 1,000 words. The morning of May 19, 1941, broke over the North Atlantic with a bleak, gray light. Waves rolled lazily against the sides of the Bismarck, their frothy crests glinting briefly before fading into mist. A biting wind whipped across the decks, carrying the smell of salt, oil, and cold iron. The men moved briskly about their duties, checking the massive 15-inch guns, testing radio communications, and running drills that had become second nature. Every man aboard knew that from this moment on, every sunrise could be their last. The ship's engines hummed deep below, an unending mechanical heartbeat. For days, the Bismarck and her companion, the Prince Eugen, had been steaming north through the icy waters between Norway and Greenland. It was a dangerous passage. British reconnaissance planes patrolled the skies, and submarines lurked below the waves. Admiral Lutyens stood on the command deck, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the horizon. He was a man of intellect and caution, one who believed in precision rather than recklessness. Yet even he felt the weight of the moment. Hitler's orders were clear. Bismarck was to strike terror into the British shipping lanes. The reputation of the entire Kriegsmarine rested on her success. Below deck, sailors whispered among themselves. Some were excited. Finally, the mighty Bismarck would prove her worth. Others were anxious, sensing that the eyes of the world were upon them. Young seamen wrote hurried letters home, uncertain if they'd ever be mailed. One man scribbled a note to his fiancée, promising to return as a hero. He sealed it carefully, unaware that his letter would one day wash ashore, waterlogged and unread. As they entered the open waters of the Denmark Strait, conditions turned treacherous. The wind howled, and massive swells crashed over the bow. Sheets of freezing rain lashed across the deck, soaking anyone brave enough to remain outside. The ship groaned under the pressure, but she held firm. Her armor was thicker than any before her, and her engines churned relentlessly against the storm. In the British Admiralty War Room in London, a different kind of storm was brewing. Reports from coastal observers and reconnaissance aircraft confirmed what they had feared. Bismarck had left port. Admiral Sir John Tovey, commander of the British Home Fleet, immediately ordered the Royal Navy's mightiest ships to intercept. Among them was the HMS Hood, Britain's pride, and her partner, the HMS Prince of Wales. The British knew what Bismarck represented. If she broke through into the Atlantic, she could devastate Allied convoys carrying vital food, fuel, and weapons to Britain. In Churchill's words, "Sink the Bismarck at all costs." By May 23rd, the two German ships were spotted. A British cruiser, the Suffolk, picked up the faint signal of their radar echo through the mist. Shadows on the horizon, giants moving silently through the fog. The message flashed back to command. Enemy in sight. On board the Bismarck, tension coiled tighter with every hour. The officers on the bridge studied their charts, calculating routes, predicting enemy positions. Lutyens paced quietly, his mind a storm of strategy. Captain Lindemann, meanwhile, kept his focus on the crew. He checked every gun position, inspected the turrets, and spoke to the men not as a distant commander, but as one of them. That night, the fog thickened until the world seemed reduced to shades of gray. The sea was black and heavy, like molten metal. Lookouts strained their eyes through binoculars, searching for silhouettes on the horizon. Somewhere out there, the Royal Navy was closing in. At dawn on May 24th, just as the first light crept over the waves, shapes began to form in the distance. Faint at first, then clearer. Two ships cutting through the mist, their long shadows stretching across the water. "Enemy vessels sighted," came the call. In an instant, the Bismarck came alive. Klaxons blared, men raced to battle stations. Massive steel doors slammed shut as the ship locked down for combat. Inside the gun turrets, crews loaded shells as big as oil drums. The air filled with the sharp tang of gunpowder and oil. On the opposite side of the strait, aboard the HMS Hood, British sailors did the same. The Hood was a legend, a symbol of British naval dominance since the end of World War I. She was older, less armored, but still the pride of the fleet. Her crew knew the stories, the songs, the history. None of them believed she could ever be beaten. As the distance closed to 25,000 yards, both sides opened fire. The calm of the morning shattered. The sea erupted in plumes of water as shells screamed across the sky. Each gun blast from the Bismarck was like an earthquake, shaking the decks and echoing across the strait. Bismarck's shells roared toward the British ships, one after another, tracing arcs of smoke through the pale light. On the Hood's deck, sailors scrambled as explosions geysered around them. The air filled with smoke, fire, and chaos. Then, at exactly 6 a.m., a single shell from Bismarck's fifth salvo found its mark. It struck the Hood near her aft magazines, where tons of ammunition were stored. For a brief second, there was silence. Then came a blinding flash that tore the ship apart. A pillar of fire and smoke shot hundreds of feet into the air. The hood split in two, her mighty hull vanishing beneath the waves in less than 3 minutes. Over 1,400 men were killed instantly. Only 3 survived. On the Bismarck's bridge, Lindemann stood frozen, staring at the spot where moments ago the pride of Britain had stood. He whispered quietly, "He is gone." Around him, sailors cheered in disbelief. They had sunk the invincible Hood. But Admiral Lutyens didn't celebrate. His face was pale, eyes distant. He knew what would come next. The British Empire had just suffered its greatest naval loss in history. They would not rest until the Bismarck was at the bottom of the sea. As the smoke cleared, the Atlantic stretched endlessly around them once more. The sea seemed almost calm again, as if nothing had happened. But the Bismarck's fate was sealed in that moment. She had won her greatest victory, and in doing so, had signed her own death warrant. The morning of May 24, 1941, would be remembered not just for the destruction of the HMS Hood, but for the awakening of an enraged empire. Across Britain, radios crackled with grim news. The invincible Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, was gone. 1,415 men had vanished into the freezing Atlantic. Shock turned quickly to fury. Winston Churchill's command was blunt, cold, and absolute. Sink the Bismarck. On board the Bismarck, the atmosphere was heavy with a strange silence. The crew had won the most decisive victory in modern naval history, yet few felt triumph. Men whispered about the fireball, the explosion, the screams carried by the wind before the Hood sank. Some prayed. Others simply stared at the sea, at the empty patch of gray where the British battlecruiser had disappeared. Admiral Lutyens, however, felt no time for reflection. His mission was not to fight the British fleet. It was to break into the Atlantic and destroy Allied supply lines. He turned to Captain Lindemann. "We've done what we had to," he said quietly. "Now we must disappear." But fate had other plans. During the battle, one of the last shells from the Prince of Wales had struck Bismarck's bow, tearing open her fuel tanks. Deep below decks, engineers worked frantically, wading through knee-deep oil and seawater. The ship was bleeding fuel, her lifeblood spilling into the ocean, leaving behind a long, dark trail visible from the air. Lindemann ordered an inspection. The damage was severe. They had lost thousands of tons of fuel, and their forward compartments were partially flooded. Every sailor could hear the groaning metal beneath their feet, the muffled rush of seawater in the hull. The Bismarck was still fast, but no longer unstoppable. As the crew worked to contain the leak, the admiral made his decision. The Bismarck would head for occupied France, where German repair docks awaited. The Prince Eugen was ordered to continue her mission alone. The two ships exchanged final signals, their light flashes cutting briefly through the mist, a farewell between comrades. By nightfall, the Bismarck was alone in the vast Atlantic, steaming southward under the cloak of darkness. Her engines pounded rhythmically, forcing her wounded frame through the waves. Inside, the men settled into an uneasy silence. Some sang softly to themselves. Others cleaned their weapons, though there was nothing left to fight. Above the ocean, British reconnaissance planes searched relentlessly. When they lost contact, Admiral Tovey feared the Bismarck had escaped, but luck favored the Royal Navy, for a time. Late on May 25th, the German ship made a small navigational error while transmitting a message back to headquarters in Berlin. British intelligence intercepted it, pinpointing her position. The hunt resumed with renewed fury. In the middle of the North Atlantic, the weather turned vicious. A storm rolled in, black skies, towering waves, and shrieking winds that hammered both man and machine. On the Bismarck, waves slammed against the hull like giant fists. Men struggled to keep their footing on the tilting decks. Salt spray and rain lashed their faces raw. Captain Lindemann stood in the control room, gripping a handrail as the ship rose and fell through the chaos. "She's a strong ship," he muttered, "but she's tired." Deep below, engineers monitored pressure gauges trembling under stress. Pumps roared as they fought to keep the flooding in check. The air was thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and fear. In those dark compartments, the myth of the unsinkable battleship began to crumble. Meanwhile, on the British side, the Royal Navy was gathering every available warship. From Iceland, from Scapa Flow, from Gibraltar, an entire fleet was converging. The Hood's death demanded vengeance. Destroyers, cruisers, and battleships fanned out like predators in the water. Even aircraft carriers joined the chase. On May 26th, the storm began to break, revealing the wounded German giant limping south. The aircraft carrier Ark Royal, operating near the French coast, launched a squadron of swordfish torpedo bombers, slow, fragile biplanes made of canvas and wood. Against the might of Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns, they looked pitifully outdated, but their pilots flew straight into the teeth of German fire, braving explosions and machine gun tracers to strike their target. The first wave missed completely, one torpedo nearly striking a British destroyer by mistake. The second wave, however, approached through the clouds, swooping low over the churning waves. Anti-aircraft guns thundered from Bismarck's deck, filling the sky with black smoke. Tracers lit up the darkness, and several of the fragile planes were shredded midair. But one torpedo, dropped by Lieutenant John Moffat, struck true. It slammed into Bismarck's stern, shattering the rudder mechanism. In an instant, the ship lost her ability to steer. Her engines still roared, but she could now only move in a slow, helpless circle. Panic rippled through the German crew. Engineers raced to jury-rig a manual steering system, crawling through knee-deep water, fighting to reach jammed hydraulics. Sparks flew as they worked by torchlight, but nothing could free the bent metal. The rudder was locked. Above decks, Lindemann stared grimly at the sea. He didn't need to ask for a report. He could feel it. His mighty battleship was crippled. She could no longer escape. As the storm cleared that night, the moonlight revealed a haunting sight. The Bismarck, once the terror of the seas, now turning slowly in circles, her trail of oil spreading like blood across the ocean. In the distance, the faint glow of British searchlights flickered on the horizon. They were coming. Dozens of ships, converging from every direction. On the bridge, Lucian stood silently. He knew what awaited them. He had fulfilled his duty to the Reich, and now only fate remained. Turning to his officers, he said quietly, "Prepare the crew. We will fight to the end." The men went to their stations one last time. They cleaned the barrels of the guns, loaded shells, and tightened their uniforms. Some laughed bitterly, others prayed. One sailor carved his initials into the steel bulkhead beside his gun mount. As dawn approached on May 27, 1941, the horizon began to glow faintly red, not from the sun, but from the gathering storm of British firepower. The hunt was over, the trap was set, and the Bismarck, the pride of Nazi Germany, stood waiting for her final battle. The morning of May 27, 1941, dawned gray and cold over the Atlantic. A light mist hung over the waves, and the wind carried the distant rumble of engines, the sound of an approaching storm made of steel and vengeance. Through the binoculars of the German lookouts, faint silhouettes began to emerge from the horizon, the shadows of HMS King George V and HMS Rodney, followed by a squadron of cruisers and destroyers. The Royal Navy had come to finish what the Hood had begun. On the bridge of the Bismarck, Admiral Günther Lutyens stood motionless. His face was pale, his eyes hollow but calm. He knew that escape was impossible. Their rudder was still jammed, their hull still bleeding fuel, and now they were surrounded by overwhelming firepower. Captain Ernst Lindemann, determined to meet fate head-on, turned to his crew and said, "Men, remember, we are German sailors. Our ship is lost, but not our honor." All across the decks, sailors prepared for their final stand. Ammunition was carried up from the magazines. Gun crews checked elevation gears and sighting optics. Below decks, engineers tightened steam lines, making sure the main batteries could still rotate despite the flooding. The ship was alive, wounded, but defiant. At 8:47 a.m., the British battleships opened fire. A thunderous roar rolled across the ocean as the first salvos screamed through the air. Enormous shells, each weighing nearly a ton, plunged into the sea around Bismarck, sending up pillars of water like exploding mountains. Seconds later, the German ship responded. Her main turrets, Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora, erupted in flame and smoke, hurling their own steel fury back at the British. The sea between them boiled with explosions. Bismarck's first salvos landed short, then over. Lindemann gave a cold, precise order. "Half a degree up. Fire again." Her second volley landed closer, one shell striking Rodney's forward deck, though it failed to detonate. The British gunners, undeterred, closed the range. Their shots began to find their mark. Within minutes, Bismarck was being hit repeatedly. A shell from Rodney smashed into her forward superstructure, destroying the rangefinder tower. Another tore through the command bridge, killing several officers instantly. Smoke filled the air. Flames licked across the decks. Yet the German gunners kept firing, their hands blackened with soot and oil, their faces streaked with sweat. Inside the lower decks, chaos reigned. The ship shook violently with every impact. Bulkheads buckled, lights flickered, and pipes burst open, spraying scalding steam. Men screamed orders through the noise, trying to seal off flooding compartments. The wounded were carried to makeshift infirmaries where medics worked without light, surrounded by the smell of burning metal and blood. At 9:10 a.m., Bismarck's forward turrets were hit. Anton and Bruno fell silent, their gun crews wiped out, their machinery destroyed. Only the aft turrets, Caesar and Dora, continued to fire, each blast echoing like a heartbeat of defiance. The British ships circled like wolves, pounding their prey without mercy. Their shells tore gaping holes through the armor, ripping apart gun mounts and shredding the decks. One by one, Bismarck's guns went silent. Her radar and communication systems were gone. Smoke poured from every opening. On the bridge, Admiral Lutyens was killed when a shell tore through the command tower. Lindemann, now covered in blood and soot, struggled to maintain command. His voice carried through the ship's loudspeakers, calm but unshakable. "Men of the Bismarck, fight to the last shell." By 9:30 a.m., it was over. The mighty German battleship, once the pride of Hitler's navy, was now a burning wreck. Her main guns were destroyed, her superstructure shattered, her decks ablaze. The British warships ceased fire, watching as the crippled giant slowly listed to one side. Still, she did not sink. Even with half her hull torn apart, the Bismarck refused to die. The ocean around her was slick with oil and scattered with debris, boots, helmets, broken steel. But the great ship floated on, her engines still humming faintly. The British, unwilling to waste more ammunition, ordered their destroyers forward to launch torpedoes. One after another, explosions tore through the hull. The sea began to claim her. Inside the lower decks, the remaining German sailors gathered in silence. Some helped the wounded. Others prayed. One young officer, his face streaked with tears and grime, whispered to no one. She was a good ship. At 10:39 a.m., the Bismarck finally capsized. Her stern lifted high into the air as water rushed into her broken hull. Men jumped into the freezing sea, clinging to bits of wreckage. Within minutes, the ocean swallowed her whole. Where moments before there had stood a floating fortress, the embodiment of Nazi naval power, there was now only smoke, oil, and silence. Out of a crew of over 2,200, only 114 survived. The British destroyers moved among the wreckage, pulling survivors from the icy waves. As they were lifted aboard, some Germans saluted their sunken ship. Others stared blankly at the horizon, unable to speak. Captain Lindemann was never found. Neither was Lutyens. They went down with their ship, as they had vowed. The sea closed over the spot, leaving only an oily stain and the sound of the wind. The Bismarck's reign had lasted just 9 days, but her legend would endure for generations. In the years that followed, sailors would speak of her not merely as a weapon, but as a symbol of pride, of defiance, and of the tragic futility of war. Even her enemies admitted it. She fought like a lion, and somewhere far below the gray Atlantic waves, the wreck of the Bismarck still rests in silence, her guns forever aimed at the sky, guarding the memory of her final stand. The cold morning of May 24, 1941, dawned over the North Atlantic like a silent prelude to chaos. The sea was restless. Gray waves rolled under low clouds, and a thick mist hung like a shroud over the horizon. Hidden somewhere within that fog were two of the most powerful warships ever built: Germany, S. Bismarck, and the British battlecruiser HMS Hood. At 5:37 a.m., the British cruiser Suffolk sighted Bismarck's silhouette through the mist. A few minutes later, Hood and Prince of Wales closed in fast. Aboard Hood, the crew was at full battle stations. The gun crews checked their massive 15-inch guns. The air inside the turrets smelled of oil, sweat, and gunpowder. Everyone knew what was coming: a duel between giants. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, aboard Hood, ordered the attack. His voice, calm but urgent, echoed through the intercom. Open fire. At 5:52 a.m., the ocean erupted. Hood's front guns thundered, sending 4 blazing shells toward the German battleship. A few seconds later, the Bismarck returned fire. 6 15-inch shells screaming across the sky. Each one could rip through 30 centimeters of armor, enough to obliterate almost anything afloat. The battle had begun, and within minutes, the North Atlantic was transformed into a cauldron of fire and death. Hood's guns roared again. Her shells fell short, splashing water across Bismarck's bow. The German gunners adjusted their aim with mechanical precision. The Prinz Eugen, Bismarck's escort cruiser, targeted Hood too, adding to the hellstorm. Inside Hood, the noise was deafening, explosions shaking every deck. Shell fragments tore through steel bulkheads. Officers shouted over the chaos. Smoke filled the corridors. Yet the crew fought on, their pride anchored in one belief: the Hood does not fall. But then came the fatal moment. At 5:59 a.m., Bismarck's fifth salvo struck Hood squarely amidships. One shell hit near the mainmast. Another, experts believe, penetrated deep into the ship's magazine where tons of ammunition were stored. For a split second, there was silence. Then, a blinding flash. The entire midsection of Hood exploded. The blast ripped through the deck, splitting the ship in two. A towering column of flame and smoke shot into the sky, visible for miles. In just 3 minutes, the pride of the Royal Navy was gone. The ship that symbolized Britain's naval supremacy sank beneath the waves, taking 1,415 men with her. Only 3 survivors were pulled from the freezing water, 3 men out of more than 1,000. As Prince of Wales veered away under heavy fire, one of the survivors, Ted Briggs, watched in disbelief as the great ship vanished. She just went. One moment she was there, the next nothing but smoke and fire. The sea swallowed her whole. For the British fleet, it was a nightmare. HMS Hood wasn't just a ship. She was an icon, a living symbol of national pride. Her destruction sent shockwaves across Britain. People wept in the streets. Newspapers carried headlines of disbelief. The Navy, humiliated and enraged, had only one command left to give: sink the Bismarck. And that order would unleash one of the greatest naval hunts in history, a manhunt across the ocean for the ship that had dared to destroy Britain's pride. The Bismarck, damaged but still afloat, turned south, heading for France and safety. But the Royal Navy was coming. They would throw everything they had, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and planes, into the chase. The tragedy of HMS Hood was more than a loss of steel and men. It was a moment that broke Britain's heart and ignited its fury. The sea that morning had claimed a legend, but the story of vengeance was only beginning.